Hey and welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about Sweden, obviously, like that's why you're here and that's why I am here, because I live in Sweden and I love talking about Sweden. But yeah, in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about two things about Sweden, like controversial things, two things which are true about Sweden. I actually recently read a book and there was a chapter called Two Things Are True, and that made me immediately think about Sweden. That sometimes there is not only one truth about Sweden, there are actually two truths. And in today's video, I want to go through them and present you with those two truths, and I obviously also want to know your opinion, so leave me a comment down below. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to my new newsletter where I reveal a bit more about Sweden, things I don't talk about on my channel, but you know, it's sometimes really good to know. So you can just click on the link in my description and subscribe, and I will keep you updated about Sweden. So let's subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and let's get started. So my first thing I want to talk about Sweden is actually the right time to move to Sweden. Is there a right time? For example, I moved in the summer in June 2021. So it has been for me 2.5 years. But yeah, I moved in summer and I thought it was a really great time to actually move to Sweden because summer in Sweden is magical. So I loved it from the first day arriving here in Sweden. But on the other side, it's not that great to move to Sweden in summertime. And the reason is that nothing gets done. So obviously when you move here, you have a lot of bureaucratic things you have to take care of. You need to get your personnummer, you need to get your kids in kindergarten if you have any kids, you know, or school or whatever it is. There's a lot to do. And in summer, things are slowing down a lot here in Sweden. So it was a bit nerve-wracking to get anything done. So two things are true, that it is amazing to move to Sweden in summer and enjoy the magical summer, but it is also a terrible time to move to Sweden because bureaucratically it's really hard to get anything done. Another thing I want to talk about is the winter here in Sweden, and two things are true. The winters can be very dark and gloomy and you don't see sun very often and it can be quite depressing, but at the same time it could be the most magical thing you have ever experienced. And if you really embrace the winter here in Sweden, then it could be life-changing. And it could be really amazing for you. There's a lot of things you can do here in Sweden. You can go ice fishing, you can go skating on lakes, and it just looks really, really amazing. And the experience you have, you maybe have not ever done before. So two things are true. It could be really bad, you know, the winters could be horrible if you especially don't like winters and the cold, or it could be such a magical time for you and you can explore new things. You can try new things. You can explore Sweden in winter. So obviously I live in Stockholm, but there is a whole other world like in the north of Sweden. You can basically travel around a sled all the time. There's so many things. So two things are true in the winter here in Sweden. Two things are true for Sweden. This country could be very, very lonely. You know, the character of the Swedes is not super outgoing. So when you walk down the street, not everyone will say hello, wants to start a conversation with you. Obviously Sweden is also very big, so if you are living more remotely, you can obviously spend days without seeing a single human. And because people are not just coming to you and want to be your friend, it could be really hard for you to have a social life here. But on the other hand, there's a lot of possibilities here in Sweden as well. And yes, it requires a little bit of an effort from your side. So maybe Swedes are not coming to you and talk to you and want to be your friends, but there's a lot of things you can do and a lot of areas where you can meet people. For example, sport is a big thing, so you can join a club and meet people through that. You know, you have things in common and then you meet regularly and you slowly can get to know each other. There are like websites like meetup.com, if you're familiar with that. There you have like different categories. You know, if you are into, I don't know, into computers, you will probably find a community there and people who meet up up regularly. Like, it is possible for sure, and you just have to look for it a little bit. I did mention it a few times, but when you have kids, it can be sometimes a little bit easier to get to know people. You can get to know the other parents because the kids are friends, or your kids are actually going to do some sports. Like my daughter, she is lately into ice hockey, which is really cool. And we have met parents there, especially my partner, who always goes with my daughter there. He's talking to people all the time there. It's really cool. Like, it's not lonely at all. Of course, it takes a little bit of time to get warm and maybe to meet up outside of the environment. But again, it is also up to you if you want to invite someone or connect with someone. Maybe not everyone wants to, but there are Swedes out there and other nationalities, of course, who are very open to make new friends. Another area which I'm personally very interested in is the entrepreneurship. So I try to go to networking events and meet different people. I have friends who actually met also a lot of people through these networking events. And I'm also talking about Swedish people. So obviously there's a lot of different nationalities, but there's also a lot of Swedish people who are very open to meet other peoples. You just have to basically put a little bit of effort into going there, finding your tribe a little bit, and then do it regularly and connect with other people and build friendships eventually. So it's absolutely possible to stay lonely here in Sweden because not everyone is talking to you on the streets or even in the queue or whatever occasions. Swedes are definitely a bit more reserved. I'm German, so I would say that Germans might be a little bit similar to Swedes, so I can actually emphasize with Swedish people. But it's absolutely possible to make friends here, even if it means that you have to put a little bit of effort and maybe also it takes a little bit of time. So maybe it's not possible to be super friends by just meeting someone once, but you have to build a relationship over time. Oh, and another thing I actually wanted to mention here is I, for example, joined an app where you can meet people. It was all about meeting women. I think it was called Go Friendly. And there are lots of the majority of people are Swedish people, Swedish women. And often I found in their bio, they basically said they're a little bit bored of their Swedish friends they have known from like when they were children or from university. It is actually a bit of a misconception that everyone just wants to hang out with their old friends. Like, there are people who are looking for new connections, but yeah, sometimes it's just a little bit harder to make those connections. But then you just go back to what I just said with all the different areas you can meet people. Another thing I want to talk about Sweden is there are two things which are true for Sweden. Sweden has quite a healthy culture. Like, people really like to go for walks or work out or, have the gyms and the classes and like be quite active. When you look around, most of the Swedes, I would also say, are quite slim or, at least not so big compared to maybe the US or the UK. But at the same time, you have like the worst things you can buy here on a daily basis. And I'm not saying worse, but like sweets and pastries are such a thing. You have fika here where you pretty much have the possibility every day to eat a little pastry and have your coffee and then talk to someone, a colleague or a friend. So there's this fika culture. But then I'm thinking, if you do that every day, like there's almost no way you can actually stay slim. Or maybe it is like a balance of like going for walks and moving and exercising and eating these things. And there's another thing which is also very prominent here in Sweden, and these are basically godis, the sweets. You have aisles of sweets in supermarkets, which I haven't seen like this in the UK or Germany. And there are even dedicated shops with aisles of sweets. It's a very common thing here. And yes, there is basically a specific day where kids are allowed to eat, like at the weekend on a Saturday. Lördagsgodis it's called. But I'm sure not everyone is sticking to just one day a week. Although we are trying to really do it, or at least the weekend, and not having any sweets during the week. But yeah, I'm almost shocked that there's such a sweet culture here in Sweden, but at the same time there's also a health culture here in Sweden. Two things are true for Sweden. And last but not least, I want to talk about how expensive or cheap Sweden can be. And you probably guessed it, two things are true. It is expensive and cheap, or it can be expensive and it can be cheap. First of all, Sweden is a big country, so you obviously have countryside and smaller towns, and the big cities. So obviously in cities, it's much more expensive, whatever you buy pretty much, than maybe in the remote areas. Housing, for example, is a very interesting subject, and I feel it can be actually cheap or cheaper compared to other countries. Obviously, again, you have properties in cities which are much more expensive than when you have properties to buy in remote areas. You can actually buy some really cheap properties here in Sweden, and I have made a few videos where I go through some properties and I found even like really cheap houses, for example. But also in general, like when I compare it to Germany or to the UK, like I live outside of a city, so very close to a city, so the prices are a little bit higher, I would say, than in the countryside, but still affordable. Like it depends if you're having a townhouse or a normal house or an apartment, for example. I still have the feeling, comparing prices, that Sweden is quite affordable. And then when we look at rent, there are also different levels of rents here in Sweden. Because when you actually rent firsthand, you normally in the queue, and at some point you get a rental property from the government, and that is actually not that expensive. Quite affordable. The only downside is you have to be in that queue and it can take a long time until you get a flat. If you rent secondhand, it can be much more expensive. But as well, I would say when you compare it to cities like London or German cities, it can be still quite affordable. Like there is such a big difference sometimes between affordable and a bit more expensive, but you have everything here in Sweden. So two things are true. You can really have cheap properties, cheap rental places, and you can have the opposite, and it can be really expensive. And one thing which is also very specific for Sweden is that when you do renovations to your house or when you get a cleaner, things like that, you actually get a deduction when you use your personnummer. That means that you pay less, actually, half sometimes of what it normally costs, because the government chips in and basically pays the other half. Make sure to use legal companies and like have a good balance between paying someone and earning a decent salary. I don't know, I just wanted to mention this because it popped into my head that this is another thing which I haven't seen anywhere else and that can contribute for Sweden to be a little bit cheaper. So two things are true. Sweden can be quite expensive, but it can also be quite cheap. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you can think of anything else, let me know in the comments down below. And I hope I will see you in my next video. Until then, have a great day and stay safe. Hej då!